So the Cold War, you had two major ideological camps, the Western countries and then those aligned with the Soviet Union. Obviously, those divides, that was a very simplified version of what was causing conflict and what were the terms of conflict for, 1,000 different local front lines. And when that ended, there is a belief that this idea of Western, economically liberal peace had won. We'd won the argument. So that work was over. And then the work was to apply the template for peace building to the remaining conflicts. Right? So conflict was behind us, except that it never was.
Welcome to Making Peace Visible, the podcast that focuses on peace, conflict, and the media. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. As infrequently as you hear the term peace these days, the term world peace is even rarer. But following the end of the Cold War, many academics and policymakers believed that a global state of peace was achievable. People talked about a peace dividend, a long-term benefit as budgets for military spending would be redirected to social programs or returned to citizens in the form of lower taxes. My guest this episode, Bridget Conley, started her career in peace building in the 1990s. Spearheaded by academic work in the U.S., the world embraced a simple formula to create peaceful nations. You would hold elections, convert the economy to a free market, pursue human rights, and prosecute the bad guys. But this approach to conflict was insufficient, and the post-9/11 years showed that the militarized world order was not going away. On the contrary, it intensified. There's been a push in recent years to focus peace efforts at the grassroots level, meaning to fund them and run them based on direction from people at the local level. While the practice of peace building has evolved and there's ample evidence of its effectiveness, the world we're living in has become increasingly violent. That's why Bridget launched Disrupting Peace, a podcast that explores why peace hasn't worked and how it could. Bridget is research director at the World Peace Foundation, a research organization affiliated with the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Her research currently focuses on mass incarceration in the United States, and she teaches college classes inside the prison system in Massachusetts. I'm looking forward to learning more about her big peace rethink and how working to end mass incarceration in the United States connects to peace. Bridget, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Let's start here. What inspired you to become a peace builder? What made you want to make this your life's work?
I think it was probably, for me, the most important case was Bosnia. I was an undergrad at the time, and I think it was, reading about it in the newspaper and having discussions. And I very clearly remember when Schindler's List came out and thinking, as moving as that film was, that it was a spark, right? That it should force our attention on how we can do things differently in our own time period.
And were you able to practice peace building? Were you able to do that as a practice?
I think the first time when it shifted for me from being a question of education and of reading and thinking was when I was in grad school at Binghamton University in upstate New York. And just walking around the city, I literally ran into Bosnian refugees on the street in Binghamton, which was a refugee resettlement town. And I started working to help them get integrated into the U.S., doing very simple things, setting up utilities, helping them file taxes. And they helped me plan my first trip to Bosnia.
I mean, we use the term peace builder and peace building a lot on this podcast, but we haven't talked much about the origins of peace building as a field, as a practice. Could you give us a little history lesson of the practice?
There are multiple origin stories to peace building. They're conceptual ones, right? Like Immanuel Kant, who talked about what would we need to have perpetual peace, right? Stability, not just ending wars or particular wars, but what do we need in order to sustain peace? There's the peace building movement at the turn of the 20th century that was really focused on creating things that eventually became the International Court of Justice or the United Nations. And then you have the peace building era of the 1990s, which is really where you see the work of peace building becoming professionalized And in that sense, also becoming diversified, the subject of research in different ways. And as it became more professional and more particular, it also became more reliant on outside funding and also more influential, right? And there are always trade-offs with every single one of those advances.
Yeah, I mean, with the downfall of the Soviet Union and the liberation of countries behind what used to be called the Iron Curtain, people thought there would be more peace. But that's not really what happened. How would you describe what happened?
Okay, so Jamil, you and I are old enough to know this theory that we had reached the end of history, right? An idea associated with Francis Fukuyama. And peacebuilding was going to take over from these political divides, ideological divides, right? So the Cold War, you had two major ideological camps, the Western countries and then those aligned with the Soviet Union. Obviously, those divides, that was a very simplified version of what was causing conflict and what were the terms of conflict for, 1,000 different local front lines. And when that ended, there is a belief that this idea of Western, economically liberal peace had won. We'd won the argument. So that work was over. And then the work was to apply the template for peace building to the remaining conflicts. Right? So conflict was behind us, except that it never was. And you'll remember when the war broke out in the former Yugoslavia, when you had the genocide of the Tutsi in Rwanda, those were referred to as if they were, things that had strangely carried over from a time long gone, right? Ancient ethnic hatreds, tribal violence, rather than part and parcel of the era that we lived in and challenges to the idea that peace had arrived. So did we gain the peace dividend in the 1990s? For some time, possibly, yes. I think all of that, though, was really dramatically interrupted once you had 9/11, right? Once you have the war on terror beginning, you have then this competition between two different logics for how we understand violence and the possibility for peace in the world. And I think over time, the war on terror won against the idea of a global peace dividend across the world.
Yeah, that was a real turning point. I mean, it's possible that to some extent it was because of the military-industrial complex that didn't want the peace. They wanted a different kind of dividend.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that there are people who profit off of war. And, that cannot be sidelined. But those profits are also integrated into larger ideological blocks, ways of thinking about how peace is secured, ways of thinking about the economics of stability, right? So what can we expect from a government? Major efforts to privatize entire economies in the wake of conflicts, which ended up empowering people and enriching people who were already, right, in a position to take advantage of privatization right after wars are ending. And so in part what you see is an economic structure, including profit from war, but also a larger liberal economic assumptions about who were the key actors, who should be the key actors in government and in economics. You also have, complicated histories in every place where there is a conflict. And so you have groups that have real grievances. You have leaders who are willing to take advantage of grievances. And so it's very difficult. I mean, you can't just say that one thing happened during that time period, but taking this really 3,000 feet glance at that time period, I think you see overall an underestimation of the diversity of forces that could contribute to violence and the assumption that a single template could respond to all of them.
Right. In a sense, the two wars that we fought in Afghanistan and Iraq showed us some of the limitations of war.
Yeah, and in addition to the places where we, very clearly were at war, we had people on the ground fighting, so Iraq and Afghanistan. We also were involved in just we've become regular bombers of places around the world. Somalia is, one clear one. And we also do a lot to sell weapons to places that are at war. A lot of the safety checks that were, created actually don't work. So there's a lot of principles that people fought hard to get put into legislation or into international treaties that actually haven't been enforced.
To halt the spread of military weapons all over the world.
Yeah, and also the other thing that does, so it's not just about having the equipment. That's obviously a big piece of it. But the question is when you start thinking through having the equipment, right? So what I mean by that is we think through, and the finances follow it, having a big military as a deterrent or having big show pieces, right? Big bombs, major systems. So even when they are not used, they enable a way of thinking about security and of putting finances behind that way of thinking that are reliant on coercion, rather than developing tools of cooperation as a way to prevent and respond to conflict. And by there, I don't just mean war, conflict, violence. I mean tensions between groups and differing interests.
Could you give us an example of how this kind of militarized foreign policy works against peace?
Yeah, so we do a lot of work with our colleagues at Shadow World Investigations. And one of our colleagues there was Andrew Feinstein, was formerly a South African parliamentarian. And he was involved in oversight of a major arms deal that included British Airways with South Africa at the end of the apartheid era. And he has spent the rest of his life documenting the way that arms deal altered post-apartheid South African government. Their biggest security concern at the time was the spread of HIV/AIDS. They had other concerns about development, right? Making sure that the country was more equitably developed so that there could be a real peace dividend for people, especially Black South Africans who own so little of the economy. And instead, incredible sums of money were spent buying equipment that South Africa didn't need and didn't use. But it became a way of playing the security game by purchasing access to foreign governments through purchases of major military equipment. And there are a lot of kickbacks and inside deals that become part and parcel of major international arms trade deals.
No, it's rife with corruption, that whole...
Yeah. We saw it. We had our vice president, Dick Cheney, on the board of Halliburton throughout the war in Iraq, where they were making, money hand over fist. You see it when, some of the first people who come to consult with a new government once it takes over are those who are doing security sector reform. A lot of times what security sector reform is a way to tie the politics.
It's a misnomer.
Exactly. It's a way to tie the certain type of politics that is signaled through purchasing equipment from Western-aligned companies.
Looking at the positive side of this, what do you think are some of the best achievements in peace and human rights in the past 35 years?
We're seeing some of it unravel. And so I think some of the biggest achievements were multilateralism. And as boring as the UN and the African Union and other regional organizations are, the work of peace building is often, this is something you work on all the time, Jamil. It's often not flashy and dramatic. The work of consulting people, coming up with collective statements, having forum for discussion and dialogue versus, throwing grenades. Those were not headline grabbing advances, but forums for talking through problems are incredibly important. So I think that was a major development, anyway, that we're definitely seeing unravel right now.
I imagine that you think the field of peace building is due for a rethink. You started your podcast, Disrupting Peace, and your first season came out last year. What are some of the ways you think peace should be disrupted?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for mentioning my podcast. We call it disrupting peace, in part for that reason I was talking about at the beginning, right? That too much of peace building has been a copy and paste kind of template approach. Instead of empowering spaces for local discussions. And that was the big move in peace building, how it developed since that time period of the 1990s was increasing localization. And I don't think that movement went far enough, and now we see it under attack. And part of the localization that also needed to occur was economic. People needed to have a voice at the table and not have all of those choices be made, regardless of the political system, have those choices made at the highest level with international donors.
Well, I find listening to your podcast to be refreshing. I mean, you describe it as a podcast about why peace hasn't worked and how it could. The problems you focus on are heavy. I mean, genocide, mass incarceration, war and violence. But the tone of your conversation is light. So you come at these issues with an intense curiosity, and you also challenge your guests' and your listeners' imagination. How has working on your podcast affected the way you think about these topics?
Yeah, so World Peace Foundation is 3 full-time staff, and we've hired up a little now, so now there's 4. Plus we have grad students, and we're supposed to cover the world, right? It's a little, right? Yeah. So one of the things we're doing with the podcast is inviting people on who have expertise on areas that we don't. And so I'm finding it's just been really exciting to be able to talk to people on topics that I don't know much about, but to bring my questions and my concern with peace to all these different areas. And so, we've looked at everything from prison abolition in the U.S., the global arms trade, to how do you sustain a gender equity movement, looking at Iceland, because these are all things that tie to creating societies that solve problems through debate and discussion, not through coercion. And that's really how I'm thinking about peace these days.
Well, now, much of your career you focused on mass atrocities and starvation and genocide, but now you've moved your focus to mass incarceration in the U.S. Why work on mass incarceration in the U.S.? In what way does it apply to peace?
I think, and I've really focused on Massachusetts, where I live. I had the opportunity to teach inside a medium security prison through the degree conferring program that Tufts University hosts. It's called TUPIT, Tufts University Prison Initiative. And in doing that, it's almost cliche because people talk about it all the time, but it's absolutely true. Spending an extended time period with people who've had very different lives and teaching in that context, holding community with these people while we're exploring text and ideas together was life-altering. And I taught in the fall of 2019 for the first time, and then COVID hit. And suddenly I knew people inside. I knew people inside some of the places that were at the most acute risk. So it started out of a COVID project, right, of really just thinking, how can I be a part of helping people I'd come to care about to draw attention to the really elevated risk that they faced. And through that, I've become a student of mass incarceration in the U.S., learning from a lot of people who've been doing this work a lot longer than I have. And also learning a lot from directly impacted people who have an incredible expertise and understanding of the depth of cruelty that is our prison system.
Well, there are currently about 1.8 million people in prisons and jails in the United States, and that's the 5th highest incarceration rate in the world and the highest of any developed country. What does that say about us as a nation, as people?
We have always had hierarchies, obviously, within our country. And I think our failure to grapple with the use of state coercive power to control ethnic and racial minorities is one of our greatest failures as a country. And obviously, the legacy of ethnic cleansing and violence against Indigenous people and the legacy of slavery and everything that came after for our Black population I joined, and I think many probably of your listeners joined in the historic 2020 protest, right? The Black Lives Matter, and protesting police killings. As far as I understand, those are the largest protest movements in American history. And somehow today we've forgotten that. We've forgotten everything that we seem to have known just a few years ago. And so mass incarceration in the U.S., it's about some of the same issues that I cared about internationally, but looking at them in my own community. I, have a number of friends now who spent many years in prison. Their youths did not look peaceful. They did not live in societies that were at peace. Some of them live 10 miles away from me. Some live 5 miles away, 3 miles. Those are not peaceful communities. They haven't been for a long time. And I think I wanted to be a part of a movement to try to expand my understanding of the issues I care about. Democracy building, community building, protecting human rights, and to do them in conversation with local leaders.
Well, I imagine the students you teach inside the prison are very different from the students on the Tufts campus. I mean, for one, this isn't just an academic topic for them. Many incarcerated people have either been perpetrators of violence or victims of violence or both.
I don't know any of the people I've worked who haven't been both. All of them have suffered violence as children in their households sometimes, in their communities, and by the state. And so for them, a lot of people are interested in talking about second chances. And when we talk to a lot of the people, the students that I taught inside and, friends and colleagues who are now out, this is a first chance for many of them. It's really a first chance. I have an interview project going on now, and we have one man who at 4, he witnessed his father kill his mother. And then he was put in foster care, and that was never a safe place for him. And then he ended up committing harm against someone else. And that sent him away for decades of his life. That's his life. And so, there's a child in there who never had possibilities.
What a tragic story.
Yeah, and it's not an unusual one, frankly. But when I teach inside, I actually tend to teach my mass atrocities and genocide prevention course. And the men inside, and I've only taught in men's prisons, but it's been really interesting when you teach on Tufts campus. For instance, when you teach about responding to atrocities or to genocide in particular, you'll get questions around, definitions and formalities and, of what is genocide and what are the policy mechanisms that might work best to halt atrocities. And when you teach it inside, students are really interested in the politics of who gets to say which cases count, which is
a very different perspective.
Exactly. But it's a major theme in the field. I mean, it's actually a very important one. And so it's been really interesting to see where their questions that they faced in their own lives, how that influences their critical analysis of new material that they're learning.
I mean, the practice of restorative justice, which is available as a program in some U.S. prison, has some parallels with reconciliation processes that are important to peace building. Can you talk a bit about what restorative justice is and how it works?
So I've done first level training. I'm a newbie through a group called the Transformational Prison Project, which is a Boston-based nonprofit that began inside the prison, began inside a medium security prison called MCI Norfolk here in Massachusetts. And so my understanding of restorative justice comes through what I've learned in working with them. And it's really interesting. They started it themselves inside.
The prisoners?
Yeah.
Wow.
And, a lot of the people who were involved were lifers. Some of them went in as kids. They went at 17, 18. And that's it. That was their entire life. So a lot of times we think of a life sentence as it's done and they're gone. But if you get a life sentence, that means you're living your life. For them, living inside meant that they wanted to find ways to deal with their legacies of harms they had experienced and harms they had caused. And so that's how they started a restorative justice process. And they do it as a circle process, right? Where men come together and sit in a circle. And there's a process of holding that space, of creating it as a safe space, breathing exercises to create the right frame of mind for engaging in serious self-exploration, and also a sense of equality among the people who are engaged, and trust. Their sort of motto is that harmed people harm people, and healed people heal people. And so it's that two-step, right, of saying we have to acknowledge the ways in which we have been harmed, right? We have to come to love and care for the self before you can then accept responsibility for the harm that you've done to someone else.
Right. When it does work, the results are remarkable. I mean, the young man that you interviewed for one of your podcast episodes, Kentel Weaver, went through a restorative justice program and now lives in the world helping others move out of prison. Could you tell us about him?
Yeah, Kentel is a student in the Tufts program, finishing his degree. And he was at the medium security prison in Concord, which is now closed. And when I interviewed him, he talked about sort of the walls that you build when you're living in a very unstable, unpeaceful context. And when you act out without sort of self-analyzing the harms that you've experienced and cause harm to other people, it's very difficult to tear down those walls and to allow yourself to be vulnerable. And Kentel does lots of public speaking. You can find him in Boston on all sorts of interviews at Tufts' website and on my interview. So I would encourage anyone listening to hear Kentel tell his own story.
Sure. He's
amazing. But now he's on the outside and he's working with TPP, Transformational Prison Project, and he's going into Department of Youth Services facilities and working with young people today and trying to help them engage in this process at a much younger age. Like, he had to go through a lot before he came to that process, in part because the times were different.
So he's trying to give people shortcuts in a sense to the kind of eye-opening realizations that he had.
Yeah. And to also, he can do it. And TPP, the group I work with, they're all formerly incarcerated. And they can tell young people that story in a way that none of us who didn't have that experience can. They are believable, right? They went through it.
Well, from a policy perspective, it seems like a difficult time to be working on decarceration, closing prisons in the United States. I mean, our current administration seems to be bent on increasing the number of prisons or detention centers. But maybe I'm wrong. Are there any bright spots you see you'd like to share?
Yeah. So working in Massachusetts, we've always had one of the lower incarceration rates in the country, which was still very highly elevated if you looked at peer countries, developed countries. In 2018, Massachusetts passed major reform, the Criminal Justice Reform Act, along with some other reforms. And there really wasn't time to see it play out in full before COVID hit. And that threw everything into, some sort of emergency crisis response. But now, some years later, we can see the impact. And so Massachusetts, since 2021, I believe, or maybe 2020, has closed prisons. Our incarcerated population is decreasing. So I think the highest was in 2011 or 2012, around 12,000 people. We have 6,000 people in our prison system today. There are around 200 women in Massachusetts prisons, 200. And colleagues, researchers at Suffolk University have said there's a pathway home for every single one of those women if the state chose that was the goal. There are ways, legal and realistic ways to get them home. And so, and we've closed MCI Walpole, which is one of the most notorious prisons. They changed the name to Cedar Junction. It was previously the home of the electric chair in Massachusetts, and there's a notorious study of solitary confinement based on that prison. It's closed now. It's closed. They also closed another minimum at Old Colony and closed Concord, where we used to have our teaching program. Now all those people were moved to a different prison. And the reason they're closing is that the population continues to decline. Part of why it continues to decline is not only decreased crime rates, but also investment in organizations like the one I've been doing some projects with TPP to help people when they get out. Because a lot of people go back not for new crimes. They go back for parole violations. And so these investments are working. They are working. And it's one of the messages we really want to get across with our research on the groups using restorative justice, on peer mentoring, on the role of having incarcerated people lead some of these social justice and re-entry organizations, because they understand each other and they know how to be there and support each other. And it's been hugely important.
What if your students taught you about how violence works in a community that people don't see? Say when you hear about a violent incident in the local news.
Yeah, so much of what we know about crime in our communities are police reports. And so a lot of media coverage is really reshaping police reports. Police reports have some information, but they're not, it's one source. They lack context and they're, written with a goal to prove a case, to, justify arrest. And I think that's extremely limited. When you look at the numbers in the United States, half of all Americans have had a family or loved one spend the night in a jail or prison. 1 in 7 have had someone spend a year or more inside a jail or prison. When we look at crime from that perspective, then we have to say we need systems that respond to these people as if they are our loved ones who have done something that they need to be accountable for. And that's a very different way of approaching it from like that criminal did something.
Right. That's a beautiful way of looking at it. I really appreciate your adding that. Is there anything I didn't ask that you'd like to say about what you've been learning from the work you do?
I would just say this is a tough time, right? I mean, people who care about international peace building, who care about social justice, economic development, labor rights,
yes.
Environmental rights. I mean, it feels like it's a really dark and difficult time. And I'm going to take inspiration from other activists that I work with that say there are 1,000 ways to get involved today. You can do it politically. You can do it in your community. You can get small in order to get big. You can join national groups and get big in order to get big. But now's not the time to be coward. My issue with our current president wasn't that he was a felon, right? But that he didn't care about the harm he caused. I have a lot of friends who are felons, and they care profoundly that they caused harm. And part of what we need to do now is really refocus on building communities that care about each other, that care that whatever our differences of opinions are, we are not going at each other with the goal of harming each other as a resolution. It's tough for all of us, but to me, getting involved in local and state issues has actually been quite joyous. So I just encourage everyone to find those pockets of joy in organizing because they're life-sustaining.
They are. It sounds like you've really found some. And it's proven, not just the work you're doing, but it's proven that there has been a positive impact, which is also gratifying when you look at the statistics in Massachusetts, for example.
Yeah. And there's more work to be done. I mean, I'm not going to celebrate where we are. Yeah, but I do think it's worthwhile to pause and recognize achievements so that we can gather more strength for the next day.
Amen. Bridget, it was a pleasure talking to you, and I really appreciate your insights, and keep up the good work.
Thank you so much, Jamil.
Bridget's podcast, Disrupting Peace, launched their second season last week, focused on resistance. You can find it wherever you're listening to this podcast. You can find more of Bridget's work at worldpeacefoundation.org. There are also links in the show notes. Making Peace Visible is produced by Andrew Maraskin. The associate producer is Faith McClure, and I'm Jamil Simon. If you like the show, please take a minute to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Or, if you're listening on Spotify, you can rate the show and leave a comment. Thanks so much for listening, and talk soon.